My basic thesis is that all of the main elements of what we think of the holiday of Hanukkah being about are things you really can find in the Torah, in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses. And whether you think that means that that is a prophetic anticipation of what Hanukkah eventually became, or whether you think that is some kind of lesson in how the sages derived what the properties of Hanukkah must be when they wanted to create a holiday to commemorate the victory over the Greeks, I don't think much matters. But what I do think is interesting is the implications for the future, because what we're going to argue is that this understanding of the roots of Hanukkah in the Torah are really also about understanding the meaning of Shmini Atzeret, the holiday of the 8th day in the autumn at the end of Sukkot. And that ultimately will not just be a way of understanding what it is commemorating, but it will also be a way of understanding what it needs to be and become in the future, especially in the wake of its use by our enemies to attack us a little over a year ago. So I'll start by saying that the Amalekim, the enemies who attacked us on what's called October 7th, but what was the holiday of Shemini Atzeret a year and a few months ago, what they named that attack was the Al-Aqsa flood. And Al-Aqsa refers to their name for Harabait, their name for their supersessionist insistence that Harabait is something that should fall under their sovereignty. And the use of the idea of flood seems like, a rhetorical flourish on their part. We'll return at the end to whether by, I don't want to say coincidence, but by some kind of convergence of semantic factors, there's a little bit more to understand in that name. But let's start by saying that there's an interesting hint to us, we could say perhaps from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the fact that this horrific attack of such great historical significance for Am Yisrael was perpetrated on Shmini Atzeret, on a Yom Tov, on a holiday mandated by the Torah, particularly because that holiday of all the different Yamim Tovim is the most like an empty vessel, right? That Shmini Atzeret is Zman Simchatenu to some degree because it's the end of Sukkot, and we call Sukkot Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. But it's not Sukkot. There's no mitzvah of sitting in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeret. And in contrast, in Pesach, it's Zman Cherutenu, the time of our freedom. That's very clear. With Chag Shavuot, it's Zman Matan Toratenu. It's about receiving the Torah at Sinai. That's also very clear. And with Sukkot, there are all of these mitzvot. We have the 4 species. We sit in the Sukkah. And then you get to Shmini Atzeret, and it's a blank Yom Tov. There really aren't mitzvot of it other than what you do beforehand and sitting in the Sukkah, and it's tacked onto the end. And you could maybe say that about Chag Shavuot as well, in the sense that, Sfirat HaOmer is really the mitzvah of Chag Shavuot, but you don't really do anything on Chag Shavuot, you just count up to it. But, there's the mitzvah of Bikurim, you bring the fruits, the first fruits to the Kohanim, and there's also Shtei Alechem, there's a special bread offering of chametz, of leavened bread on Chag Shavuot. So even Shavuot, I would say, has an edge on Shmini Atzeret in terms of a clear specialness in terms of things you do. And Shmini Atzeret just seems to be this Yom Tov with meaning as yet to be determined, seemingly. And for that reason, especially, I think it's hard to take the fact that the attack of October 7th happened on Shmini Atzeret and shrug it off. I mean, of course, you can't in any sense shrug it off when it's so recent, but at the end of the day, the Yamim Tovim have been holidays for Am Yisrael for thousands of years. And so something that happens on one instance of them cannot easily overthrow the significance of that calendrical regularity over millennia. And you see that even, for example, with the Yom Kippur War in Israel, which was a terrible calamity for the state of Israel, and many Jews died, and it was horrific at the time. But 50 years later, you don't first think of the Yom Kippur War when you think of Yom Kippur. You are aware of that connection. But because Shmini Atzeret is itself not such a strong flavor, I think there's more of a risk of saying, oh, so what is Shmini Atzeret about now? Is it about October 7th? That would be horrible, right? It can't be a day of rejoicing if you're just remembering this horrific tragedy that occurred. Now, the way that many people will get out of this is they'll say, no, we already have a meaning for Shmini Atzeret. It's Simchat Torah, right? It's the time of our being, joyful about the Torah. We already invented a meaning for it. We already took this empty vessel and we put something into it that we liked. And especially if we're Hasidim, then, now we get blind drunk on Shmini Atzeret. We dance with the Torah. It's a great holiday. Now, the only problem with that is that we're not supposed to add to the Torah. So it doesn't really work to say, well, this holiday, I'm not really sure what Torah is getting at here. So it's an ice cream holiday. It's all about ice cream now. And people do that even a little bit with Chag Shavuot, with the dairy thing. But, it's one thing to invent a few customs of what you eat or whatever. That always happens, cultures evolve, etc. But to say that Shmini Atzeret is Simchas Torah, if we don't really have any basis for it being that, especially in the land of Israel, right? Simchat Torah is easier to say, well, we have this second day after the first Yom Tov in Galut, and, maybe we come up with something to give it a little more flavor. And it is indeed an old tradition, but at the end of the day, it's not a tradition we have from the Torah itself, or even it's not something that's rooted in Torah Shebal Peh to the same degree, let's say, that, our understanding of Chag Shavuot being associated with Zvan Matan Toratenu is. So I think that we should treat Shmini Atzeret on its own barrel and say, what is the Torah teaching us about what Shmini Atzeret means? So that is one way of launching this discussion. So now I think we can also come at it from another direction by asking the following question. Where does Chanukah come from, and how is that connected with how the Jews in the present day or soon need to rebuild the temple again? Chanukah is an 8-day holiday in the winter, which has a famous lighting of lights associated with it. And we understand, in one sense, that the reason we light lights for 8 days is because there was this Nes Pach Hashemen, there was this miracle of olive oil lasting for 8 days to light the candelabra in the temple in the time when the Maccabim were purifying it after throwing out the Syrian Greeks in their stunning and miraculous military victory over them. But we could ask it from another direction and say, but why 8 days? I mean, is that number arbitrary in a historical sense? It happened to be 8 days, and so therefore, we make it 8 days? Or should you say, well, since it was a nes, since it was a miracle, really what that means is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose for it to be 8 days. And why did he choose for it to be 8 days? And is that part of some message that links back up to other things? And there are different ways of getting into this, but one is to just look at the calendar of holidays in the Torah and Sefer Vayikra. So we have here a list of holidays starting with Pesach that goes through all the different stops in the calendar of Torah holidays and finishes with Sukkot. And it starts off, Ach b'hamisha asar yom lachodesh hashvi'i b'asavchem et tfu'at haaretz tahogu et hag Adonai shiv'at yamim b'yom harishon Shabbaton u'v'yom hashmini Shabbaton. So, mark the 15th day of the 7th month, when you've gathered in the yield of your land, you shall observe the festival of Hashem to last 7 days, a complete rest on the first day and a complete rest on the 8th day. So that's mentioning Sukkot at the beginning and Shmini Atzeret at the end. But then it talks about, the 4 species, the fruits, the plants you're supposed to all wave together. And then it goes back and says, okay, now you're going to sit in Sukkot. Basukot teshevu shiv'at yamim kol ha'ezrah beYisrael yeshvu b'Sukkot. So 7 days you shall sit in a booth or in booths. All the citizens of Israel will sit in booths. Now, we don't have a roundup after that somehow connects to the 8th day again. It just finishes talking about Sukkot in 7 days. And then, interestingly, what happens next is that the Torah moves on away from this calendrical list because it's finished, supposedly, with Sukkot. And then it goes on to say, Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, tzar et bnei Yisrael vayikhu elecha shemen zayit zach, katit lemaor leha'alot ner tamid. Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, command the Israelite people to bring you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting, for kindling lamps regularly. So we finished the calendrical part, and then the next thing it so happens that the Torah is telling us about is the mitzvah of lighting olive oil lamps in the temple, the menorah. And I think I first heard this pointed out by Rabbi David Foreman, that in one sense this already is kind of a shadow reference to Chanukah, right? Because we could have had a holiday around the winter solstice, and if we had, it would have come next. It would have come after Sukkot, and it would have been mentioned here. We don't have that, but we do mention the menorah and the oil, which is not a coincidence, right? It's kind of a blank space that should contain a holiday, but doesn't, but it does contain the content of what will eventually become a holiday. And you can understand that solely on the basis of the Torah being aware that having a holiday at the winter solstice where you light lights is an almost animal desire of human beings, right? This is referenced in the Gemara. It talks about Adam HaRishon and how he wanted to have a holiday at the winter solstice because basically everyone's afraid that the sun's going to go out and never come back. And when it starts coming back, there's much cause for celebration. So if we view it in those terms, you could say this is the Torah nodding to the fact that, of course, you want to have a holiday here, but no, that's too pagan and that's too universal. And so we're not going to do that. But maybe eventually we'll have to, we'll introduce it rabbinically, which is what eventually ends up happening. But I would note that here we mentioned Shmini Atzeret at the beginning of this section about Sukkot, but then we round up again with talking about Sukkot as sitting in booths, and then it just finishes with 7 days, you shall sit in booths, and then it doesn't say anything about the 8th day in the repetition. And then we go on and we start talking about Shemen, not about Shmini, 8th, but about Shemen, oil, the olive oil. And so there is a sense in which it's also kind of, by a play on words, it's chaining together, it's connecting the idea of the oil, which is part of the holiday of Chanukah, with the Shmini of Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day. And then we realize, okay, Sukkot is an 8-day holiday or festival period that ends with Shmini Atzeret. And then we go over and we have Chanukah and it's another 8 days. Like, why is that happening? What's the connection between Shmini Atzeret and Chanukah? Why should one have to do with the other? Other than the fact that there's this holiday-free gap in between them, and we can connect them chronologically, why would we associate one with the other? So there we can go to our next source, which is in Sefer Vayikra, and note that the first time the temple is built, not the temple, but the Mikdash or the Mishkan, right? The first time they have a functioning tabernacle where they're going to have an altar, they're going to dedicate it, they're going to do sacrifices on it. There's this 7-day waiting period where the Kohanim have to sit and help to sanctify this whole structure that's being built. And then on the 8th day, that's when it is ready for work, and they perform sacrifices, and the fire comes down and consumes it. That's at the beginning of Parashat Shmini. ויהי ביום השמיני קרא משה לאהרון ולבניו ולזקני ישראל. On the 8th day, Moshe called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. So then they make the sacrifices, and the fire consumes it, and then Nadav and Avihu make their sin, right? So that's Hayom HaShmini. So really, the dedication of the altar and the functioning tabernacle is achieved on an 8th day, the first time that happens. And then you think, all right, so I have the association of 8 days with dedication of a mizbeach, of an altar, of my whole sort of edifice of structure needed for performing sacrifices. And I also note now, when you think about Sukkot, I have the 7 days of waiting in a temporary structure, and then I go back into the house on the 8th day, right? Now I can go to my permanent home. And so there is this sense also in Sukkot that there's a kind of, you're in something that is built but not fully valid, and then you move to a more permanent house or built structure on the 8th day. So there also is a kind of parallelism there. And that already might have been enough of a basis for the prophets to put in Divrei Yamim, that when Shlomo Melech built his Beit Mikdash, his first temple in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, that it's going to be on Shmini Atzeret, right? So it starts with Vayikhalu El HaMelech Kol Ish Yisrael B'Hag Hu HaChodesh HaShevi'i. All the men of Israel assembled before the king at the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month. So that's Sukkot. And then there's a gap I'll skip over. Vaya'as Shlomo et Hag Be'et Hahi Shiv'at Yamim V'chol Yisrael Imo Kahal Gadol Me'od Milvo Hamat Ad Nahal Mitzrayim. ויעשו ביום השמיני עצרת כי חנוכת המזבח עשו 7 ימים והחג 7 ימים. At the time, Shlomo kept the feast for 7 days, that's Sukkot, all Israel with him, a great assemblage from Hamat to Wadi of Egypt. And on the 8th day, they held a solemn gathering, and that was an Atzeret. It was really Shmini Atzeret. And they observed the dedication of the altar for 7 days and the feast 7 days. So this thing that was first done in Parashat Shmini and was on an 8th day relative to the beginning of his dedication is now being done by Shlomo on the festival of Sukkot, so that the 8th day will be Shmini Atzeret. So in the first instance of a Beit Mikdash in Yerushalayim, Shmini Atzeret, the empty vessel Yom Tov, became Zman Hakamat Mikdashenu, right? It was the day of the establishment, or Zman Hanukat Mizbachenu, right? The day of the dedication of the altar. And from that point forward, it would already, just based on Tanakh, based on what's in the Hebrew Bible, it would make sense to say, okay, Shmini Atzeret, the meaning of it is, that's the holiday where you're done in the impermanent structure, you go to the permanent structure, you remember the idea of, like, you have a house, and you're going to make a house for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're going to build a Beit Mikdash for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it is the Yom Tov for Beit HaMikdash. And this is a point I first learned from Rabbi Avi Grossman, which I think was a beautiful comment on this passage from Divrei Yamim that we were just reading. So all of this is kind of, I started with sources that are really maybe the ones in Chumash that lead to the point in Divrei Yamim, right? That Shlomo, by the time he decides this is when his Beit HaMikdash is going to be built, where is he getting that from? He's getting it from the Torah itself. He sees that the 8th day is about completion, and that it's something, we get that from Brit Milah also, from the circumcision, that you change creation to improve it for the sake of service of God on the 8th day. And that is what it is to build a house for Hashem in this world that he didn't build here for himself. We're building it, but it's for him. And so we're improving the world according to his Torah. It's like that with Brit Milah. It's also like that with the eighth day when we do any kind of dedication of a tabernacle, and this is the eighth day holiday where that's meant to be done. And that's why the Torah chains it over to the lighting of the menorah in the temple immediately afterwards. However, we're not quite done with what we can get out of these different sources, because there's an additional aspect, which I think is in some ways even more remarkable. Everything we've been talking about so far is just about the eighth dayness and how Shmini Atzeret functions well as an eighth day to commemorate the establishment of the temple. But it's also possible to understand other aspects of Chanukah if you look in the Torah itself, that don't just have to do with the fact that Chanukah is also about a dedication of the altar, and it's an 8-day holiday, and it calendarically is maybe connected as the sort of next seasonal leap after Shmini Atzeret over to the winter and to the winter solstice time, but also about the Greeks, right? Because Chanukah is also about how the Greeks are this culture in competition with ours that wants to replace Torah with Hellenism, and that they worship practical wisdom and prudential philosophy and aesthetic beauty, and that all of these are things that we need for the temple, but that are also temptations to idolatry that can replace our worship of Hashem if we're not careful. And so we can't simply say the Greeks don't matter on the one hand, and there's a reason that we were nearly swallowed up by them culturally and ideologically, because there's such an affinity between Talmud Torah and love of wisdom, right? And on the other hand, although we need them, that has to be bounded. That has to be elevated in the right way. It has to be dedicated to service of Hashem in the right way. And really, everything I just said is just an interpretation of a verse in the Torah itself about Yafet, the father of Greece, according to the Torah, the son of Noach. The Noach says about Yafet, whose name basically means beauty, Yaft Elohim leyefet weishkon be'olei Shem wa'yehi chena'an ebed lamo. Right? So that may God either enlarge or make beautiful Yafet and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a slave. So dwelling in a tent, yishkon, like mishkan, we're really just, those are temple words. And we're talking about Yefet having an important role to play in the success of the temple. And that's the beauty and wisdom of the Greeks, right? Their understanding of how to make beautiful things, in general, how to make things, how to create the wealth that's needed to build a temple, all these things that we might admire the Greeks for within reason, but where we have to bound it. It has to be for the sake of the tents of Shem. It has to be for the sake of Avodat Hashem, and then we have some use that we can get from the positive things that Hellenism, so to speak, discovers. So now the question is, can we somehow connect this back to Chanukah more directly, right? Because all we said was, okay, fine, the temple needs, in some general sense, kind of, the positive aspects of Hellenistic culture. But now let's think about where there might be other reference to Greece in this whole story with Noach. So first of all, Noach is a mariner, right? He builds a boat. He's a craftsman and a mariner. So there's something very Greek about Noach. In some ways, there's a whole lot, if you dig, we won't talk about it all now, in the story of Noach and other passages it references, where it's like the Torah's engagement with Hellenism, subtextually. Noach, in a sense, passes on to Yafet and to Yavan, his grandson, which is Greece, his capacity for crafting a seaworthy vessel and the sort of prowess in technology and in navigation that requires. But there's also something that's more direct in the story of Noach, which is the Yonah, the dove. Okay, the dove is a bird. We read it in English and we just say, okay, it's a dove. But what is the word for dove in Hebrew? It's Yonah. And what is Yonah? It's Yawana. It's Greece words, right? It's the same word as if you were saying to Greece in ancient Hebrew. So there's a reference to Yawan, even in just the fact that he's using a dove. And that might seem like a one-off, like, okay, fine, but what does that matter? But what does the dove bring back to Noach, right? When he sends out the dove to find out what's out there, he's unable to see these faraway lands that might be above the water, might be below the water. And he's using the dove as a way of, so to speak, shedding light on parts of the world he can't see. He's not actually using light, but it's the same kind of thing. You bounce the Yonah off of the mountain with the olive tree growing on it, and then it comes back to you, and then you get some information about that olive tree. So it's working the same way that light works, actually. So the Yonah is being used to illuminate by Noach. It's also carrying in its mouth an olive leaf, right? The olive is used to make light in the temple, right? That's what Hanukkah is all about as far as the Nes B'Chashemen is concerned. We light the lights because of the oil that lasted for making light in the Mikdash with the menorah in the temple, with the candelabra. So in this grease-named bird's mouth, we have the leaf of the tree that we're going to use to make light, that represents the light of wisdom, the light of Hashem. And the olive itself, in a sense, also represents wisdom. And you can get that easily if you want to crib it from Greek mythology. The myth of the founding of Athens is about a contest between the god of the sea and the goddess of wisdom. Who's going to get to, have the city named after them? It ends up being the goddess of wisdom because she gives them an olive tree. And it makes sense because the olive is, again, a source of light, but also not just that, it's a source of food, it's a source of medicine. And you have to understand it. You have to be wise. You have to be crafty in order to get any of that out of it. If you just have an olive and you don't know, how are you going to think, I can make light from this? It's just like this weird, bitter tasting fruit that seems poisonous. But if you salt it, then you can, eat it if you prepare it in the right way, like curing it, and you can make, ointments out of it, and you can make illumination from it. So it represents, even if you don't have Greek mythology, it represents in general the idea that if you have practical wisdom, then there is a lot of illumination hiding that you can reveal and benefit from. So the zait, the olive, that the Greek bird or the grease bird is carrying in its mouth to Noach is itself, as we said, a kind of illumination that Noach is getting because he's able now to learn about things he can't see. He's shedding light on darkness by sending the Yonah out. And I'll say as an aside, it's also interesting if you go back to creation, the idea of Ruach Elohim mirachefet al pnei hamayim, right? That the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That verb of mirachefet is very evocative of a bird hovering. We actually have in Parashat Ha'azino the idea of a bird hovering with that same verb. And so it's interesting, right before, when we have darkness and water, we have something hovering over the water like a bird does, and then it's Vayomer Elohim yehi or vayehi or, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So it even, brings in the idea of light in that sense as well. All right, so now we have grease, we have olives, we have some other notion, but related notion of illumination or finding things out. And when you read the pasuk, it's suddenly that it hits you in the head. ויחל עוד 7 ימים אחרים, ויוסף שלח את היונה מן התיבה. All right, so when he sends out the dove, he waits a 7-day period. And then it says, the dove came back to him toward evening. ותבוא אליו היונה לעת ערב, והנה עלי זית טרף בפיها. וידע נוח כלו המים מעל הארץ. So the dove came back to him toward evening. So that's like the 7th day is he waited 7 days, and then the notion of it coming back towards evening is like counting to an 8th day. The dove came back toward evening, and then there in its bill was plucked off an olive leaf. So Noach knew the waters had decreased on the earth. So we have waiting 7 days, and then an 8th day, and we have the olive that we use to make light in the temple and grease all being associated here. And that is eventually going to be all these elements that go into Chanukah, right? Chanukah is the 8-day holiday about olive oil and victory over the Greeks, where we have to defeat them because we can't accept their idols, but we also do want the positive aspects of wisdom and beauty that they are so known for in the temple. And if that all weren't enough, the clincher is this, right? If you think up until this point that this whole thing about the Yonah is strained, where it's like, okay, maybe, but to take that all the way to Chanukah is a bit of a stretch, because it's just a story about a guy with a bird. And yes, there's an olive, but how do we get the temple out of that? And yes, there's this other mention of Yafet with the temple or with the dwelling in a tent, but in this flood story, but it seems all unrelated. But also at the same time that Noach is sending out the birds and trying to figure things out, we get a chronology of what's happening to the world. With Tanach HaTeva b'chodesh HaShvi'i b'shiv'asar yom l'chodesh al harei Ararat. So in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. V'hamayim hayu haloch v'hasor ad hachodesh ha'asiri b'asiri b'echad lachodesh nir'u roshei harim. The waters went on diminishing until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. All right, so what's that? That means that Noach's Teva lands on the mountains of Ararat, like the first dry land that he can find to land on, when? On the 17th of the 7th month. In other words, during what will eventually be the week of Sukkot. The waters went on diminishing until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st of the month, Rosh Chodesh Tevet, the tops of the mountains became visible. So that's Chanukah, right? Chanukah ends shortly after Rosh Chodesh Tevet. So we're talking about like the almost brightest day, usually the 7th day, of Chanukah, where we have the first of the month of Tevet. So we have this chain being drawn by the Torah from Sukkot over to the time when Chanukah will be. And it's about the drying of the land and the mountaintops poking up so that it can have an olive tree on it, so that the Yonah can fly off and find the olive tree somewhere. It's part of the same story. It's the same process. So the reason the Yonah is able to go find an olive tree is because this is happening, because of the Chanukah that is happening in the moment where there are mountaintops that are dried up and there's like the possibility of plants growing on them. So when we string it all together, we have in this time of the story of Noach and the flood, the notion that the Greeks have to bring their wisdom and beauty into the tents of Shem to make the temple successful. And we have the Greek bird dove that's carrying the olive that's for making light in the temple in its mouth. And we have this calendrical connection between Sukkot and Chanukah that's all being laid out there in this story. And so I think on the basis you can say that the Torah is prophetically telling us there will be a connection between Sukkot and Chanukah, and it will be about the temple, it will be about Chanukat HaMizbeach, which first is achieved on Shmini Atzeret, when we have the dedication of the Mizbeach of Shlomo Melech, and that 8th day of Shmini Atzeret is what gives us the 8 days of Chanukah later on. And I think I can throw in one more source, just to, because I wasn't expecting this one, but that I realized it resolved another puzzle for me, which I had always wondered about in Sefer Nehemiah, which is that in Sefer Nehemiah, there's another instance of rededication. And really, by the way, this is a more obvious point people are usually aware of, but when Haggai Hanavi, the prophet, is talking about the beginning of the Second Temple period, where they're coming back from Persia, he makes a prophecy about rededicating the temple when, Erev Chanukah, right, on the 24th of Kislev. And so in one sense, you can just say, okay, Chazal are getting that the 24th of Kislev should be the day before the first day of Chanukah, because although the war with the Maccabeim happens much later, Haggai was already talking about dedicating the new temple on that date. But that doesn't go back far enough, as it turns out. Haggai, the Navi, is already looking at Chumash, and he already understands, and he's also looking at Shlomo, right? He already understands there's this notion of Hayom HaShmini, the eighth day being the one when you have to dedicate the Mizbeach, and also that it's going to be about light, it's going to be about the olive, it's going to be about Greece even, right? You can get all of that from the flood of Noach, but there's just one other source that I think falls along the same lines in Nehemiah, where Nehemiah is again about the moment where they're coming back from Persian exile, and they want to rededicate themselves in Yerushalayim and start keeping the Chagim again. So they have this big celebration of Sukkot where they have to learn how to keep the mitzvot of Sukkot. And there's this strange pasuk that always puzzled me, where they're talking about Sukkot, and it says, "V'asher yashmi'u v'ya'aviru kol b'chol areihem v'Yerushalayim le'emor tzeu hahar v'yaviu alei zayit v'alei etz shemen v'alei hadas v'alei tmarim v'alei etz avot la'asot Sukkot ka'katuv." Okay, so they should proclaim and publish in all the cities and in Jerusalem, saying, "Go out to the mountain and fetch olive branches and branches of wild olive and myrtle branches and palm branches and branches of thick trees to make booths, as it is written." So this is kind of a weird melange for Sukkot. Sukkot has the four species, which are palm and myrtle and willow and etrog or citron. And then there's, make your sukkah, make your booth, which, really doesn't have a specific kind of plant you're supposed to make it out of, but customarily maybe you take certain plants. But here it's just kind of mixing it all together, where it mentions tamarim, so that's one of the four species. It also mentions etz avot, which is the Torah's word elsewhere for talking about hadas. And then it also says hadas again here. So it's hadas, avot, which we thought was hadas, and it mentions tamarim, which is, the lulav. But then it says zait. And for good measure, although you might say, it's referring to another tree here, it's alei zait and alei etz shemen, the oil tree, right? So what is this thing with olives and the oil tree doing in the middle of a Sukkot celebration? You could say, this is just local color. These are the branches they had to go gather to build their booths. What does it matter, right? You can make, if you live somewhere else, you can make a sukkah out of all sorts of things. But here they were making it out of olives because that was the local flora. But now that we know that at times that you're rededicating the temple, which are associated with Sukkot, that you should already be thinking ahead to Chanukah, isn't it interesting? It doesn't just say alei zayit. It says alei zayit ve'alei etz shemen. So in the same way that it repeats avot and hadas as two different versions, perhaps, of the same tree, at least in the Torah's language of referring previously to the hadas as avot, it refers to olive, and then to emphasize, it's like, and just in case you didn't get the point that I mentioned olive, think about shemen, think about oil as well. So in this moment of rededication of the temple, or rather, let's say, of rejuvenation of all the Judaic practice in the land as they're returning to Jerusalem, we're thinking about olives and we're thinking about oil. So that bit of Tanakh, also what we have from all of these elements from the flood of Noach, and then what we have from the parts of the Torah that are telling us about the holidays, that are telling us about the menorah, that are telling us about the dedication of the tabernacle. When you add it all up, I think it's clear that whether you're saying that the Torah is prophetically anticipating this, or whether you're saying that Chazal are deriving it from the Torah, and that's why they tell us of the Nesbach Hashem, and in order to make Chanukah about these things, there has to be, in a sense, according to the Torah, eventually a holiday in the winter around the time of the solstice that's going to be about light. It's going to be about Shem and Zayit. It's going to be about the temple and rededicating the temple. And it's going to be 8 days because Shmini Atzeret is the Chag of Zman Hakamat Mikdashenu. Shmini Atzeret is the original day of dedicating the temple and building the temple, going from the less permanent structure of the Sukkah into the house, bringing Hashem into his house. And to close, I think, what is striking about this for the present day is that it presents us with a real opportunity to reclaim Shmini Atzeret, right? Shmini Atzeret wasn't totally ruined by the October 7th attacks because no one can ruin something that the Torah has had us doing for thousands of years with what they do in one day, no matter how horrific. But it did underline and emphasize for us that Shmini Atzeret has been treated a bit like a blank holiday where we can just fill it in with whatever we like. We can make up something like Simchas Torah and say that's what it's about, even though the Torah didn't command that for us. But really, if we study the Torah, there's already a concept of what Shmini Atzeret should be about in the Torah that Shlomo HaMelech picked up on and that we can pick up on from him and that Chazal picked up on, and that's why they gave us Hanukkah almost in a sense to point back towards Shmini Atzeret and say, don't miss this point, that you can rededicate the altar, you can rebuild the temple. And all of this is there right from the beginning in the story of the flood of Noach, that Yafet should dwell in the tents of Shem, that the Yonah is carrying the olive branch. And what's so amazing when you put all that on the table is to go back and recognize that our enemies, when they attacked us, they called their attack the Al-Aqsa flood. In other words, the Temple Mount flood, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so much trying to beat us over the head with the message that we should be getting from this, that he put in the mouths of our enemies the two terms that go together to make this whole point, right? You go to the flood, you study the Yonah, you study Yafet and all of that, and you foresee Hanukkah by looking at the flood, and then you go to the Temple Mount, you look at what the Torah tells us about dedicating the tabernacle, and you say, the 8th day, and you look at Shlomo and you say, Beit HaMikdash, on the 8th day, Shmini Atzeret. So I think when you add it all up, what this has to mean is the following. Bezrat Hashem, and Bimheira v'Yamenu, speedily in our days, we will rebuild the temple. And when we dedicate, it should be on Shmini Atzeret. And when we do that on Shmini Atzeret, we will redeem the day. We will take our enemy's wicked attempt to stop us from asserting sovereignty in our land, and we will recognize in it a message from our Creator that we need to step up and take action in the opposite direction, that this attack is being waged against us by people who understand that as our enemies, the ultimate way of stopping us in our tracks is to prevent us from building a temple. And we need to understand that the ultimate thing that will cement our hold in this land and establish our purpose in this land of bringing the message of Hashem to all of humanity is to build a temple. And by doing so, like Shlomo Melech, on this day that the Torah anticipates, we will be able to take the horror of what happened on one day of Shmini Atzeret and let it become a reminder of what we never can shirk or leave behind as part of our obligation as of the Hashem, which is to build a temple and dedicate our nation's purpose in this land to serving Hashem through his Torah, with his commandments that include his Mikdash, his sanctuary, that we, Bezrat Hashem, will build on Har HaBayit soon.